Good morning, everybody, and welcome back. I don't know where time went. It feels like a month went by really fast, and we're here again. But very excited to have you all, and thank you for being with us, for volunteering to serve on this task force. And I'm very excited to pick up with where we left off from last session. So I will, with that, turn this over to Barrick to begin working through our agenda.
Wonderful. Thank you, Stephanie. And it's good to see everybody, although I had spoken with Jordan and Stephanie before I was out for the first meeting. So I want to introduce myself. My name is Barrick Abramson. I'm Senior Policy Director at the Keystone Policy Center. And a few of my colleagues are here. Our CEO, Christine Scanlon, who many of you may know from her time in the legislature and in the governor's office. And also one of our newer colleagues this year, Nicole Mira, joined us from the state as well. And she's on this call, will be with us going forward. So excited to have Nicole and Christine both on this call. I'm also excited to really dig into some of the substance. And I had a chance to both help plan and then view the recording of the last session, and was really grateful that we got to ground that first conversation really in the why of what we're here about. Today, we're going to spend some time, as you probably saw on the agenda, reflecting a little bit on that call. I appreciate everybody who filled out the survey. I'm going to nudge everybody who didn't to get in there and complete that survey. We got responses from, I think, about 10 folks. Would love to get some more, and as we go through the agenda, you'll understand why. Not only do we want to hear folks' opinions, because it will help us to shape the conversation and just know really where everybody is entering this conversation, but probably equally or more importantly, it helps us to shape these conversations in terms of knowing where is there a real hunger or a need for additional information, whether that's data, perspectives, or conversations among the members. So I will in a minute drop that survey link back into the chat and nudge everybody to check their email and ask if you could get in there and fill out that survey this week. I'm also going to share as we go through today some of the findings from it. But because it has been a minute since everybody was together, we wanted to start off just reflecting back on that first conversation when we really heard that anchor in the why. And would love to get folks' reflections. What was it that jumped out to you? Whether it was your aha moment in that conversation or something that tugged at your heart or got you thinking about this work, what stood out to you in that conversation? And how does that affect how you're coming to this work and informing how you're approaching the roles on this? And I will just tell you as a facilitator, I'm going to start off leaving it pretty much up to folks to raise your hand and jump in. But also the Barrick in me that is not, I'm not ashamed or afraid to start calling on people. So I'll give us a minute of quiet, but I'm not afraid to start calling on people. So everybody give that question some thought. What was it that jumped out at you? And how is it informing how you're approaching the work? And I'll ask folks initially down in the reactions button, you can raise your hand. So I'll start calling folks as I see hands up, and I'll try to point to who's going to be next. And when I don't see a next, I'm just going to pick somebody who's going to be next. And Lynette, I see your hand up first, so would love to hear from you. What was it that stood out to you, and how is that informing how you're coming to this work?
The things that stood out to me was, one, just the overall, 3 of the youth eventually understood that out-of-home placement was probably the best place for them, and they made peace with that. The one youth really struggled with it and didn't think she should have been removed at all. And you could just see the pain in her face. But what really struck with me was what I didn't hear. I didn't hear any of them talking about what kind of services or treatment they got, what their families were doing in treatment, or had they had any opportunity to participate in the development of their own plan. And for me, that was huge, because we have built this system with family engagement meetings and all of that, and the youth aren't feeling a part of it.
That's a good point on where things are, where their awareness or the connection is. I'm going to go next to Dave, and then I'm going to look for another hand or call on somebody without one. Dave, what jumped out at you, and how are you approaching the work because of it?
What jumped out at me? Well, there was quite a few things that jumped out at me during that meeting. I mean, first and foremost, I want to give Beth Montoya just a ton of recognition. What an amazing lady to share that story and with all of us. it pulled at your heartstrings to listen to that. And I guess that should challenge all of us to want to do better and to really work through this task force. Other things that jumped out at me was listening about the first panel with providers on how, whether it's policy, rule, statute, whatever it is that gets in the way of, I don't want to say stopping kids from running away, but intervening to stop with kids running away. That was something that really stuck out to me, that we need to work through that over this next couple of years to really, are there any changes we can make with that or recommendations we can make? The other thing, listening to, I want to say the youth, but they're all adults and things like that now. But what amazing young people to share their stories. But one thing that I heard was how much deeper they had to penetrate into the system, whatever you want to call that system, how deep they have to penetrate into the system to get our help, to get the services they need. And that, I'll say, we as a state of Colorado weren't able to provide some of that sooner before they had to penetrate so deep into the system.
Thanks, Dave. Appreciate that. Seeing no more hands, this is where I will just start calling on some folks. I'll try to give you a little heads up so you have a moment, but I'm going to go to just order of my screen. And just a reminder, if you're on the task force, if you could turn your video on, and if you're not a member of the task force, we ask you turn your video off initially, and then we'll have public comment at 10:45. And with that, I see some hands popping up. I certainly appreciate that. So I'm going to go to Renee, followed by Ashley, and then Stephanie. Renee, what were your thoughts coming out of that first meeting? Renee, you've still got yourself on mute.
Thanks. I have a problem with I raise my hand that I have to do two buttons. It's just said, a lot of the same thoughts that were already expressed, but in addition, just the extreme diversity of the experience of the different youth, just it was a great illustration of how every experience is different, and it's not going to be a one size fits all, and the reasons for their actions all have different motivations, and the way they react to their circumstances is all unique and different. So just very unique for each person going through.
Thanks, Renee. I'm going to go next to Ashley and then Stephanie. I'm going to ask everybody, both in your own comments and as you come up and maybe you want to reflect on others, what were those aha things? What were the things that stood out? And particularly importantly, how does that inform either things you think we need to be talking about or how you're coming to the conversation today and going forward? Ashley, I'll go to you next and then Stephanie.
Thanks. Yeah, I think for me, I also had the thought that I think Dave shared about, it really hit me that Tamisha only got the services she needed after commitment, and how that has lifetime consequences, and what a shame it was to hear her say that. And she was somebody who was wanting it and asking for it. So it just makes you wonder, it kind of echoes the sentiment shared that, we're supposed to be giving, services, and somehow there's a disconnect. But more than that for me, and this is probably more about my position at the OCR, is how not being heard for the youth led to such frustration that was often the impetus for bad decisions in running. And that, that correlation between that frustration and anger and not being heard really resonated for me and the work that we do.
Ashley, I'm going to probe a little bit on that because I think you're digging in on something that a few folks have raised. What, if anything, does that lead you to want to hear more about, to learn more about, or to think that we need to spend some time focused on?
Well, I think on the services part, it's always hard to know exactly what's out there at any given time because it changes. And so I think a deeper understanding of the service array, how it's applied, how when you're in an RCCF level of care versus a QRTP level of care, like how that actually works. What are some of the barriers? What are some of the processes? What's actually available right now? Because I think that changes year to year, month to month. And, I think for our part, the hearing the youth be frustrated is something that we have heard for the last few years and did take action on with our client directed counsel bill and some other things. And so I'm really excited to see how that impacts some of these youth going forward. We'll start seeing that after January. It makes me think about how we might want to measure that or start looking at that. So that's something for us to chew on and think about, I think.
Appreciate that. Stephanie, you're the one hand up, so I'm going to give other people a heads up. I'm going to go to you, and then Becky, and then Elizabeth Montoya, in that order.
Great, thanks, Barrick. I think a couple things came to mind. One is, I worry a lot about terminology, and I think the word runaway is laden with judgment. And that worries me because, as we heard from our youth, their innocence here, right? I mean, they were brought into these systems by no choice of their own. And to the word runaway, I think if we were to take a poll, right, just generally in America, people would say those are troubled kids, or those are bad kids, or those are kids lacking, judgment, right? And so, my agency has struggled with that word since the beginning of this project. And ultimately, that is the word that was chosen because that is the word that is used in state and federal law. When we look at homeless youth, when we look at runaway youth, those are the terms that are legally used. And so we stood by that. But as a commission or a task force, I would like to explore at some point what we're talking about is a symptom, not the cause. Right. And if we were to dig deeper into the voices that were presented to us, what these youth were saying is that perhaps the child welfare system didn't account for their needs to still stay in touch with family as often as they should. Or perhaps the behavioral health system didn't keep children in touch as much with their families and communities as they should. And so I just worry about the word runaway, how it, I think, has judgment. I think it focuses on the symptom and not the cause. And I guess I want everyone, let's have a new vocabulary while we're at it. It's a small charge, but why not? So those were some of my thoughts. I'm a little ill at ease with that terminology and language.
Thanks, Stephanie. I saw a lot of nodding heads as you were mentioning that. We'll go to Becky and Elizabeth, and then Brian, I'll go to you next at the PD.
Sure. Thanks, Barrett. Good morning. I agree completely with Stephanie's point about the terminology. I really appreciated in the last meeting and was kind of blown away actually by how, when we walked away from the meeting, the picture was painted that this is a very, very complex set of problems. It's not, this didn't happen when this child was 12 or 14. This is a lifetime of problems that, of issues that culminate in running or certain behaviors. And so, especially Elizabeth Montoya, your description of Timothy's life was just so helpful in painting that picture that's really, really complex. And so I appreciated that. I also really appreciated both panels were incredible, but I wanted to mention the provider panel just to shine light on how difficult it is to work in that level of care. There's a lot of pressures and it's just super, super difficult to be at that level of care. So I appreciated the providers who were willing to speak up and talk about that. It was a great meeting.
Thanks, Beck. I'm going to go to Elizabeth and then Brian, and then we've got somebody on iPad. I'm going to ask you to remind me who that is, the NAD iPad, but we'll go Elizabeth, Brian, and then to that person.
Good morning, everyone. I want to thank you all for being here. And Becky's right. Everybody, has said pretty much it's a complex set of problems. I think that it's super important that we focus on, like you said, what leads up to the problems, what leads up to the runaway behaviors, right? Is we're not hearing our kids for whatever reason. And Timmy and I had a lot of support, even though we had some failures, we did have a lot of support. And for some reason, we just weren't hearing the fact that he was just full of fear. And I think that comes down to the basics. These kids are full of fear. What I hope to see out of this task force is that we can empower these agencies and these providers to better protect our kids. We can work on prevention, maybe instead of having to intervene at the last moment. Maybe there's something we can do to prevent these behaviors from happening in the first place. Thanks.
Thank you. And thank you again, I know on behalf of this entire task force. I'm going to go to Brian and then our member on the iPad who will remind me who that is. And then Kevin, I'm going to go to you after that.
Part of why I was excited to join this and see the change that we can make is I understand law enforcement is kind of the tip of the iceberg, but I appreciate the group coming together to really look at the causes. I have to echo what Stephanie said about runaway as a label, and in law enforcement, I can speak loudly that I hear that a lot. We label it as a runaway and it gets a certain minimal response. I'm proud of the work that Denver does, but I look around at other law enforcement agencies and see how their response is not as robust as maybe I like to see. And I'd like to see that kind of roll out statewide, that we're able to make a much more informed, comprehensive sort of response to these kids that we know are already troubled. And so now we've got to figure out how do we keep them safe, knowing that law enforcement's not going to be the solution, that this isn't the problem I solve. Coming together as a group is really the best way. So I'm excited to be a partner in this.
Thank you. And I appreciate the chat help. Norma, I'll go to you on the iPad and then over to Kevin and then Chase. I'll tag you in. Norma.
Great. Thank you. And you figured out who I was. Thanks.
Yeah.
Sorry about this. I definitely want to echo Stephanie's comments because I think they're spot on. But I think for me, it sort of, I don't know, brought back for me that kids are asking children to heal and grow in an atmosphere where there are a number of other children who are disruptive and disrupted and, are trying to heal as well. It is almost an impossible task for a child. And so I just think that that's something maybe that we can think about as we move forward. Also with Tamisha's story, I also thought, sometimes kids aren't ready to deal with certain things, and that's okay. We need to sort of help them learn how to move forward in spite of some of those things and in spite of not being able to work through a particular issue. There'll come a time where they can do it, where they have enough ego strength or whatever to be able to work through those things. But we have to listen to them when, enough is enough. Enough has to be enough pushing. And I think sometimes we expect so much from them that they have to work through everything that's happened in their lives before they can move forward. And I'm not sure that that's accurate.
Thanks, Norma. I'm going to go to Kevin and then Chase and then Dave Hayes. Kevin, if you're talking, you've got yourself still on mute.
Try that. Sorry. Just a couple of thoughts that probably have been covered to some extent. Again, I want to emphasize that I was struck by the number of situations and circumstances that accumulate in kids deciding to run away or walk away or whatever you want to call it. I'm not so, I came out of the meeting saying, we're not going to like solve the treatment issue and stop all the kids from running away or something like that. These problems are much more complex than that, and everyone's in a different place in treatment. So that was the first thing. The other thing that I continue to be curious about, and a reason that I'm on this task force, is there seems to be a reluctance or not an emphasis on stopping kids from running at the source. And that remains to be a concern. And I listened to that from the meeting. I particularly was struck by the comments from the gentleman from Southern Peaks. It said, we basically can only do so much to stop kids from running. We can't physically intervene or do certain things that maybe we'd like to do. So those are mine.
Thanks, Kevin. We're going to go to Chase, Dave Hayes, and then Beth McNally, please.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me. I wasn't a part of the last meeting. I was unavailable for that. But I do have some thoughts on some of what's already been shared, specifically piggybacking on, I think there's a lot of red tape with all of this stuff. From a law enforcement side, there certainly is. I'm in Canyon City, so I work closely with Southern Peaks. And right now, I think that's the biggest issue that we're having is that while most of our runaways are from the facility, necessarily, we do have runaways in town, but generally what we deal with is the runaways from the facility. And there's red tape in that. There's certainly perception issues, stuff that we've talked with Southern Peaks about. But the thing that causes the red tape is the liability associated. So Southern Peaks incurs liability when these kids run, or if they try to keep them from running, they incur liability there. The police department incurs a ton of liability because if we respond and don't do anything and something happens, that's on us. If we don't respond and something happens, that's on us. So I think while I definitely agree with everybody else, and I think these kids are in an unfortunate position at times, specifically in our area, there's a lot of red tape and liability associated with runaways. And that's where we're running into issues on our end.
Appreciate that perspective, Chase. I'm gonna go to Dave Hayes and then over to Beth and then Janelle, please.
Yeah, good morning. Can you guys hear me okay?
We certainly can, thank you.
So good morning. First, thank you for inviting me to join you fine folks and the projects that you're working on. I'm currently the president of the Colorado Chiefs Association. I'm also the police chief in Louisville. Previous to that, I was with the Boulder Police Department, retired there, and have been and now the police chief in Louisville. So I think this is my first meeting, but from what you're all very caring individuals, and what do we do? And I think for me it comes down to is how we show up, and I would equate it to in terms of runaway calls and how we deal with runaways. I would kind of equate it to the fentanyl crisis that we're also all dealing with. And I know in the last couple of legislative sessions, what we heard from parents after parents who lost their 20-something-year-olds to fentanyl poisoning or overdoses, what we heard from the parents was they appreciated the law enforcement response, but what they asked us to do is stop calling them overdoses. That's an old name, an old terminology, and we can all probably have a picture in our mind of what an overdose used to look like, right? Good or bad, we had kind of that in our mind. That's not what it is today. What it is today is that we are poisoning our next generation. If you had a chance to go to the Denver Fentanyl Conference last year, the year before, one of the Drug Enforcement Administration administrators said it best like this: picture making chocolate chip cookies in a 55-gallon drum and then stirring it with a 2x4 and then adding in fentanyl and then packaging that stuff. You know, it's non-pharmaceutical packaging or wherever these labs are that are making it. And then it's no wonder why you might have a couple of kids taking fentanyls from the same 55-gallon drum. Some overdose, some don't. The recovery rate, as we know from fentanyl, is about where it is with alcohol, about 5%. And so what the parents asked us to do is stop calling it an overdose, because that's a different mindset for the cops, old and young. What we should be calling that would be drug-related deaths, and drug-related deaths or poisonings is what we're going to be working on from a statewide protocol perspective. We treat those now as if they're homicides, which means that we take electronic devices, computers, phones, all those kind of things, trying to figure out where the source of the fentanyl is. And so I guess I would equate that to what you kind folks have been talking about is this is our chance with these young folks of how we show up, what our essence is, what's the role of police. And maybe it's not the role of the police, but there really isn't anybody else standing in line to do that. You know, it's kind of the after 5 and on the weekends kind of thing. So what do we need to do to change that perception? What kind of training do we need to provide? Because that contact with that young man or young woman will carry them for a long time, and they'll remember that contact, sometimes good, sometimes bad, but that's our opportunity to perhaps make a difference. And I'll stop there and see if anybody has any questions, and I think that's all to stop there.
Thanks, Dave. You know, and I think we've had some questions raised actually, and so I am going to go to Beth and Janelle in just a minute, but first I want to provide the opportunity for conversation as we go through this, not be overly structured. And there was a couple of folks in the chat that, Chase, your comments raised some interest. So I'm going to, Stephanie or Elizabeth, I'll open it to you if there's specifics you wanted to follow up on. But Chase, it seems like there's just a general interest in that perspective you shared and the different perspectives and that sense of red tape. Stephanie, is there anything in particular you wanted to probe on, or Elizabeth?
I think I just wanted to understand better what law enforcement is experiencing in terms of that red tape. But then Chase, you also said something about, the perceptions. And again, I would love to just know perceptions from whom, about what, that type of thing.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. So the red tape that I'm talking about is Southern Peaks is a treatment facility, and everything that I'm going to talk about is specific to that because that's what I know. So it's a treatment facility. We also have Pueblo Youth Corrections just down the street in Pueblo, Colorado. Most of the kids that we've been dealing with at Southern Peaks, and I've been here for 8 years. When I first started, there was somewhere like 150, 200 kids there. They've dialed that back substantially. And for a while, it seemed like things were getting better. And by that, I mean fewer runaways, fewer issues within the facility. And then I think there was a lot of, and I could be wrong on this, but I believe case updates, law updates over the last year have provided them some different standards that they have to meet. And so the perception from the law enforcement side is now we are taking care of somebody else's business. We've had extensive discussions with their assistant director there, and I think we've brought them in for briefing training or scheduled to do that to help provide perspective for our guys, because from our side of things, it appears that it's their facility. They need to run it. They need to make sure that they're taking care of the youth that are there. However, like I said before, they're super limited on what they can do. Certain levels of force that they can use. I mean, it's a facility, it's a treatment facility, so these kids can just walk right out the gate. It's on the eastern part of Canyon City, and there's some desert and some open fields out there. So these kids can just run for days. The perception on the law enforcement end is because Southern Peaks only has a certain level of staffing, we're responding to these things, and staff isn't always following because either there's more issues going on within the facility that we're just not aware of. So that's not being relayed to us. Like anybody else, some of their staff obviously gets off of work, needs to have time off, but they want to take smoke breaks in the area. So perception from law enforcement is, okay, we have kids running, we don't have anybody following, but they have staff members out here. What's going on with that? So that's the perceptions that I'm talking about as far as what is Southern Peaks allowed to do? What can they do legally? What's our responsibility on the back end? And then the red tape for us is the liability associated. And I would assume that's for them as well. I know, again, I've talked to Lori Billington, who's their assistant director up there pretty extensively, but the red tape is, and I apologize, but we're damned if we do, we're damned if we don't. So if we do respond, there's potential that we contact these kids who, again, are just displaced youth. Some of them have committed crimes, but we're responding, we're dealing with them. Well, now we have to do something to get them back to the facility. There's a major highway right there. Some of these kids want to run in the street. They don't want to go back. They want to do anything they possibly can not to go back to the facility. If we don't do something, they get hit by a car, or we don't do something, somebody picks them up, takes them somewhere, and something happens to them. That's the liability that we incur. If we do something and we try to take them back to the facility that winds up in some sort of use of force, now we've just used force against a child who is simply committing a status offense by being a runaway. And so there's liability and there's red tape in that. So the community is mixed on the facility in general, or at least has been since I've been here. And again, either we're doing too much and we shouldn't have done, X, Y, and Z to get the child back to the facility, or we haven't done enough, which has caused them to be further displaced and further at risk, to be completely honest with you. So I know on their side of things, there's a liability in the red tape on what they're allowed to do. And then on our side of things, there's a misperception of what they're doing to try to alleviate, some of these kids running away, mitigate those issues. But then there's also the general perception that either we're doing too much or we're not doing enough. And then we incur the liability either way.
Thank you, Chase. And Becky, I see your hand up. I'm going to get to you in just a minute, but I know we have Brandon from Southern Peaks on. And Brandon, before I ask you to just offer some perspectives from your point of view, I also want to just kind of reground us in what are some norms that normally we talk about at the start of some meetings. And Chase, I know the whole advantage of this task force is we're bringing people together who may not typically spend this much time at a table together. And I think it's great that we are. I'm going to ask everybody, if anybody offers, remember, everybody is owning their own perspective, and I'm going to ask everybody to assume the best of intentions in sharing that candor, even if sometimes it feels at odds with what we may believe or how we feel. Know that everybody at this task force is bringing their own experience and their best intentions to this, and it's intended to be a productive conversation that may lead to some differences of opinion on issues, but hopefully what we do is we find some common paths forward and some common ground in all of that, because everybody does share the same goal for those outcomes. And Chase, I'm not in any way picking on you. It's just a good point for me to remind all of us of the complexity in bringing different perspectives together on an issue that is so close to the heart for so many different reasons. So Brandon, you've heard a little bit of what Chase shared, and without trying to turn this into a debate, because that's not what we're here for, would love just your perspective on some of these issues of the dynamics between law enforcement responding and a facility dealing with the situation. And then Becky, I'll get to you if it's relevant to this particular topic. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, the sense I get is that, the perception is often, a result of frustration around not resolving a particular situation. I mean, most of our kids that are what you call labeled runaways are really what I would call walkaways of kids that are frustrated, angry, emotionally blown out. They have choices of, either getting aggressive or walking out. And it's typically the same kids, over and over again. So, I think when everyone's looking for that same, kind of resolution, how to stop that, I think, perceptions run deep and frustrations happen. I hear, same of those frustrations from the community, those frustrations from family, staff, law enforcement. And so, I think that, drives a lot of the perceptions, a lot of the, where things are. I don't think it's, like I said, like what everybody's missing, it's a complex issue, but fundamentally, I do agree that, from the perception, what I heard from Chase is like, why are they, dealing with some of these things when, we're the treatment facility that is supposed to be able to, stop these things. And, and there's only, and I think what I'm hearing is when there's red tape, why can't we stop them? And I think there is a level that we can only go, to as a facility, that then they have to do the very thing that we're, they think we should be able to do, and which is, physically stop them in those moments. And like I told a gentleman last meeting, I don't necessarily disagree with that, that perspective. So, but, I think, it's, like I said, I think it's complex. There's, unintended consequences on any direction you go at times. And so, I think it has to be thoughtful, but, I definitely think that the continuous pattern volume of these issues are, is what causes these frustrations and perceptions.
May I speak to that just real quick?
Yeah. And Chase, I welcome you in. I'm just going to preview to everybody, we've got about 5 minutes more in this session, and I'll give us about another 5-minute leeway, but I do want to make sure we move forward. But Chase, I absolutely want you to be able to respond there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I apologize. I am coming from, the whole reason I joined this task force is so that I can shed light to our guys here at the Canyon City Police Department on what Southern Peaks is dealing with, so that we have a broader perspective Certainly not trying to dime anybody out, just simply stating that this is the view from our side of the street. And so I'm part of this in hopes that we can all collaborate, get on the same page, and going forward, maybe iron some of this stuff out. So that's, appreciate the response to that, Brandon.
And appreciate you, Chase. Like I said, I'm going to give us probably about another 10 minutes, and then I am going to move us on. I'll also invite folks to drop their comments in the chat. I'm going to be making sure we copy and paste everything in there into our notes from the meeting, so we capture that. But I see a lot of hands popping up. So I'm going to go in this order and ask you where you can to be as succinct as possible. I'm going to go Becky, Beth, Elizabeth, Janelle, and Lori in that order.
Thank you, Barrick. I just want to sincerely thank Chase and Brian for being a part of this work. I know Brian has been around a lot of these tables through the years, and it's great to meet you, Chase. One of my hopes, and I represent the trade association of the providers, so I advocate for providers. One of my hopes for this task force was this conversation. I really hope that we can, if it's in this meeting or in a sidebar meeting, really go down the rabbit hole of working better together with law enforcement. We have some jurisdictions in the metro area that straight up have refused to come to our calls. Like they'll say, we can be there in 2 or 3 hours, or we're not coming. Totally get it. It's a resource issue. It's a workforce issue. They hate coming to our facilities 400 times a day. I get it. But on the other hand, if it's that one time when that child is in danger, we need, I think we can find a better response together. So I really, really appreciate this opportunity to work with you guys. And I really hope we're able to dive deep and be creative with this. So thanks for your time.
Thanks, Becky. So we'll go Beth, Elizabeth, Janelle, and Lori.
All right, good morning. Yeah, going from the first session, it was really moving, really, all the speakers. But it also left me with a ton of questions, especially with the facilities, wanting a better understanding, what are the statewide mandates versus individual facility policies. There was mention of, when there's a level of an emergency, then maybe you can intervene. Well, like, what does that look like? And, I also, having that background of 13 years in law enforcement, I can speak to, yes, each agency has an individualized approach to taking calls that are archaic and backwards. The agency I worked for, if a youth was deemed a chronic runaway, meaning they had run 3 times prior, there was no law enforcement response. In fact, there wasn't even a phone call. It was simply a fax to a record specialist, and a report was put in that this youth ran. They were entered into the system as a runaway, and then a date of when they returned. So absolutely zero engagement or outreach with that youth or the facility. And so really wanting to direct our conversation to, what can we do to make really statewide mandates for both, facilities, but also law enforcement agencies.
Thank you, Beth. I'm going to go to Elizabeth and then Janelle, and Dennis, I want to make sure we get you in if you've got thoughts as well. Elizabeth and Janelle.
Thank you. I'm not sure if this is the time to approach this, but one of the ideas that was presented in a conversation prior with the treatment center was that they had tried to hire a what they called a resource officer, which would be an off-duty police officer that would be on site during the daytime hours. And they had done some research on it, projecting that this could deter up to 80% of their runaway behaviors. So they went through the process of hiring someone, and then found out that the state law prohibits the use of or the carrying of a firearm on their property. And then Denver Police Department doesn't allow their officers to work without their firearm. So the whole idea got scrapped because of some state laws that are in the way. So that needs to be a conversation that can happen, and it might bridge some of these challenges that we're facing between law enforcement and facilities.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'm going to go to Janelle, and then everybody. And Lori, I apologize. I misunderstood and thought you were a member of the task force. Unfortunately, because of the size of this task force, we do have to hold members of the public's comments and limit those to the public comment section. I'd invite you, if you've got thoughts on this topic that you want to weigh in on, go ahead and drop them in the chat. And at 10:45, we will have opportunity for public comment. But just due to the size of this task force and the agenda you already see stretching, I've got to limit the agenda topics to discussion on the task forces. So Janelle, I'll go to you, and then Dennis. I'm sorry, I'm being told that Lori is representing Dennis from the state. My apology, Lori. You can completely disregard what I just said. I'll go to Janelle and then Lori.
My name's Janelle Goodrich, and I am on this task force, and I run an organization where we only get appointed by law enforcement at local, state, and federal level for the highest risk of youth, which is human trafficking. And so every single person on my caseload is labeled a runaway. We've had kids at Southern Peaks and Shiloh and all of these things in certain placements. And what I will tell you is everything that I'm hearing is there's so many different elements, and I completely agree with that. But here, as I'm sitting here listening to these things, I've been making notes, and some of the things that, as this task force is supposed to do to start these conversations, to bring things forward, to make these situations different is the law enforcement do's and don'ts and what they can and cannot do, and the public and the providers and all of these outside people not understanding or having education around what this situation is. And then who are they screaming at? They're screaming at the police officers. They're screaming at the placement facilities. And then there's so many different laws in so many different areas, and none of them are synced. None of them complement each other. And then you've got one kid who is extremely high risk going all over the place, and you can't do anything about it. And it's extremely frustrating for everyone. And it puts a lot of people in danger more than just the youth. I also know that running away is not a crime, right? And there's no such thing as the runaway police. And you have law enforcement numbers that are so far down. And so I know, as frustrating as this is, my heart goes out to the officers in a lot of these situations, because they, like Chase said, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. The facilities are as well. And these kids know that they can walk out and do whatever it is that they need to do. And I think when laws changed, we went from one side to not being able to do anything to be doing way too much to the other side of the spectrum. And it's frustration. And I think there needs to be more education about what these laws are in everyone's different avenues in order to bring something together that syncs and has harmony together, that keeps everyone safe. Most importantly, the youth that is running, and to do those things. And it makes me sad what Beth just said about if they're labeled so many times that they don't even get it. I know on my client list, I don't have any kids that I serve that are below that number, none. And there's also the other thing that you can't put them in facilities because they have to do intakes in these places. And usually they're involved with DHS. And as soon as they hit certain things, they can't even be taken there. We have no foster parents. We have kinship placements that don't want to deal with this stuff because honestly, foster and kinship treated like junk. And then you go through all of these things and then they have no oversight. These kids are running, they're running to the streets like Dave talked about, then there's drugs, and it just adds all of these other things. And so there needs to be so much more education around what each laws are to bring something together, like Chase was saying, to make statewide requirements that are in unison for every single individual that has contact with these children, because it's not working. It's not working. And I'm getting all fired up because I have all of these kids on my caseload and they run and, then they're like, well, why aren't the police doing anything? And I'm like, because they're down in numbers and they have a murder that they're trying to solve right now, or this. And there's no such thing as that. And I love the resource officer thing, but there's the whole situation becomes political, and there has to be some type of movement that pushes things forward to make this work in unison. And so just doing the case management for some of the highest risk youth, I see this happen all the time. So I understand all sides of it, and I'm equally as frustrated. So there's my 2 cents for the day.
Thank you, Janelle. And I think, your passion and your underscoring of the complexities and the tensions between different stakeholders involved are exactly why we need this work to be done. And I so appreciate the CPO for having laid out this work, because it's going to be a long haul, and we're going to get some recommendations and some progress along the way. But I appreciate you naming that. I am, we're coming up short on time. I've always let us run over. I'm going to go to Lori and Dave, and then I'm going to have to end this session, and we're going to move on with the agenda. So Lori, you're up next, and I apologize for my confusion about task force membership.
No issue. Thank you. I just want to bring up, going off of what Stephanie was saying about this being a symptom, right? There's a lot of talk about law enforcement and restraint and policies and procedures and such. And to me, that's a reaction. That's a reaction, after the fact, after the behavior has occurred. There's a lot of things that can be done proactively, right? Such as, developing a plan, a very concrete plan prior to the youth entering into treatment. And then also there's, there has been no comment about trauma-informed care during this discussion. Trauma-informed care, there's a lot of, research out there that shows that trauma-informed care can prevent this type of behavior. And that is something that we have required based on the requirements of the federal government, the statutes, that trauma-informed care must be implemented within our licensed facilities. And everyone had to, all of our licensed facilities had to turn in a trauma-informed care plan that my team, along with OBH, has reviewed and approved. Right now, we're in the process of helping our providers get those trauma-informed care plans implemented into their daily practices. There's a lot of focus right now around trauma-informed care and how it applies to youth, but actually trauma-informed care applies to the staff that are providing the care. That's where the key is, in my opinion, along with our facilities. And then there hasn't been mention about Family First. Family First is all about keeping kids in their home environments and wrapping services, in those home environments. So I think that going forward, right, we need to have further discussion around Family First, trauma-informed care. And while we love our law enforcement and our providers and so forth, I think that there's a lot of things that we could do prior to those things. And my team was responsible for the investigation of the incident that involved Timothy Montoya. And so, I think that there's a lot of information that we can glean from that investigation that we can have in, further discussion down the road about, again, what can we do proactively?
Thanks, Lori. And we are just, I think we're getting a little astray from where we were on the agenda, which is why, Dave, I'm going to give you, final thoughts. And again, we're trying to reflect, not so much just reacting to what everybody's saying, but on what this is bringing up from that first conversation and what it's informing about where we need to go. And in a few minutes, I'm going to ground us back in what are the specific tasks and charges that are asked of this task force. But Dave, I'll give you the last thoughts for this session.
Wow, that's exciting. I get the last thoughts. I just don't want to lose the idea that Janelle brought up around, we have, this task force is just full of a wide range of experiences, diverse backgrounds, so many different areas that we work in. And I think one thing this task force really needs to receive is education on the do's and don'ts of law enforcement, the do's and don'ts of providers. What can they or can't they do? I just think there's a lot of misinformation or perceptions out there that we all have because of our experiences on what people can or can't do, and some of those are incorrect. So we definitely need to be educated on what people can and can't do, because that's where we can make changes. We need to find out what really can happen and then what we need to change or work on changing.
Thanks, Dave. And thank you to everybody. I know I started this conversation out with, what did you hear that first conversation? And that sparked a lot of thoughts for folks, obviously, both directly what they heard and how that connected with their perspective and their experience given their role and their entry point into this conversation. whether as a provider, as an advocate, or as law enforcement. So I know these are going to be charged conversations, and every time I ask, a simple question, it's going to surface that this is much more complex than any easy question I may ask. Our agenda is kind of split up into a couple of sections. Hopefully the next one gets a little bit easier because we're going to get into more of just some of the technical and administrative of how we're going to function and operate. After we get through that, I'm going to bring us back to re-ground us in what are the specific things that we've been asked to analyze and what kind of reports are we going to be generating, because I think it would be really easy for us to go down probably about 37 different rabbit holes, and that's not to diminish the importance or the impact of any of those on kids' lives. It's just that we have a charge to execute on, and so I'm going to work with Stephanie and with Jordan and with all of you to make sure we stay focused on that. I will also make sure we get the break in there that I promised. I know 8 a.m. is coffee time, and we're going to need some breaks. If you need to slip away for just a second, I certainly understand. I'll get us a break here in the next half hour when we'll all step away. One reminder, because I've seen some people come in and out. If you're a member of the task force, we would certainly love to have you on video so everybody can see you, connect with you, and so we frankly know who the task force members are. If you are not a member of the task force and you're a member of the public, we welcome you listening in, and we would just ask that you turn your video off until we get to the public comment session, which will happen as we get close to the back half of this meeting, probably right around 10:45, depending on where we are with the agenda. But I'm going to invite Stephanie and Jordan back in. There's a few technical things we need to handle, things like identifying a vice chair, and then we want to clarify what the role of the task force is. I think it's really important, given how much time all of you are committing to this work, that we're very transparent about what agency and authority this task force has. There's task forces that are created that have no role or agency whatsoever other than to offer ideas. There are some who develop specific recommendations and are tasked with writing specific reports. There are others that actually have authority to advance change. And we want to be transparent about what's going to happen with all of the conversations and the recommendations that are generated here, as well as how we're going to approach things like, what if we don't all agree on something? I know that seems crazy to think, but we want to be very transparent about how we're going to handle if one group thinks one thing, and we have some others that say, here's some other considerations and implications you might want to name. And so as part of that, we're going to have Stephanie run through those items of vice chair, of how are we going to make decisions and what is the role of this task force in providing input. And we'll have a little Q&A if we get to that, and then I'll sneak us in that break, I promise. So Stephanie, I'm going to hand it off to you.
Great. So yes, just circling back to everybody, at last session, we provided you with what I think we call the task force overview, which was a summary of why we're here. It also was a summary of our charge. And if you have that document, that is on page 3. But really, what it does is it summarizes the charges that are otherwise in state statute. And before I begin, does everybody have that document in their possession or have you read it or referenced it? Just if you have familiarity, if you would put your little thumb up on your screen or in person, if you want to put your thumb up. I see Lynette does not have that document. Okay, thanks, Jordan. Jordan, just put it back in so that everybody can just pull it up fresh if you need that. So I'll give you a minute for that. Yeah, and what we essentially did in this document, again, it's a reframing of the statute. You can always refer back to that document as well. But here's what it is that we are required to analyze. And I think we've hit on a lot of these different points today. In other words, task force members have said, this is where we need additional education or information, or we are uncertain, if you will. So we are required to analyze, and I'm going to use the word analyze. I think that's just a super important word here. As you can see, the sufficiency of statewide data. I'll let you read that. I won't read this entire slide to you. The second part is the root causes of why children run from out-of-home placements. And just as a refresher, the root causes in part was supplied to you is just an introduction, our last session, but as a reminder, we also have a research team from the University of Denver who is going to be conducting focus groups with youth in out-of-home placements, and their findings will be due to us in March. And so, we will be awaiting that information before we as a group begin to make any sort of concrete recommendations and or put anything into a report, because obviously I think from all the comments here today, we can see that our youth have a great deal to teach us about these systems and how we can improve them. So that I would say is forthcoming to us in a couple more months. The third thing that you see here are the differences between runaway behavior and age-appropriate behaviors. This came up during our legislative efforts when the statute was drafted. And I appreciated it because people had suggested, look, again, going back to this labeling notion, right? At some level, we have young people who are young people, right? They are curious. They have, desires to be with their friends, to be in the community, and let's be careful about not labeling, these youth as somehow so unique or judge them in any way, right? Like, let's be careful that we really kind of use a scalpel in our approach to defining what are runaway youth and what are otherwise age-appropriate behaviors, and how do we treat these, as I think someone today said really well, uniquely, right? There's got to be a unique approach to each of these youth, and one size will not fit all. The next that you see is that we will be talking about behaviors that lead a person or a facility to file a missing persons report. I think that, again, and I appreciated Dave's comments earlier, because it's been my experience that indeed we do have laws, we do have regulations, and everybody is interpreting those differently. And that is part of this problem as well. And so one of those concerns came up here, which is, do we even have a standard way of requiring a facility or a foster family for filing a report? Like, what is the magic number? Is it 6 hours? Is it 6 days? Right? Those sorts of things. And we will be covering that. We will be having a strong legal primer as we go into these sessions. We will be examining both state and federal laws, because they are related here, as well as state regulation. And so we have a pretty robust presentation for that will be upcoming. Moving on, we have really, it kind of goes back to the data. What is the relationship between runaway behaviors and the likelihood of that child's experience being a victim of crime or a victim of some sort of external conditions, right? And I think I say external conditions because it's not just crime. As all of us know, kids are being exposed to the elements. They're not getting nutrition. They're not getting education. They're not getting mental health care if that's required. So it's really, I think, a charge that we examine what those consequences are for youth when they run overall. Again, the next charge, the comprehensiveness and effectiveness of existing state laws and regs. Again, we will be going through that. We will also be using our task force members who work in these facilities to talk to us about, what are their practices and procedures. We also will then be going to the next charge, which is, are there best practices statewide and nationally for preventing and addressing runaway behaviors? And so we have a member of our team researching those practices nationally, but I would ask all of you, if you do have ideas, if you're aware of programs in other cities or other states, please, please, please drop those links to us in the chat, because all of you have robust experience, and we will not necessarily catch everything that is out there despite our best intentions. Again, we rely upon this group of experts to help us in this process. You are our partners, and I want you to hear me say that. Last, we talked about this already today. One of our charges is to talk about what entities are responsible for youth when they do leave their placements. And what are the efforts to coordinate a response to these behaviors? We've already touched on that. Thank you for our law enforcement and facility conversation today. And finally, it's a conversation about what are the resources that we need, right, to improve communication and response from the multiple entities that are involved in these youth situations. So those are the charges, and what we envision is really giving you units or modules, for lack of a better word. Each session that you appear, you will say, and I'll just give this as an example, the legal framework, right? And you will be given a presentation with materials, with
Where do you
source.
leave your lacrosse stuff? In the locker room.
If somebody could go off mute, thank you. And so we will be giving you resources. Again, the modules that we are setting up for each session are focused around these charges. And so you will receive that education, you will receive articles. We will be giving appropriate time to talk about that as a task force. And then Barrick and his team will be leading us through those materials to say, what do we think about these materials? Are there gaps that we need to fill, etc. So that is the basic process. Moving on to really the rest of the legislation. You know, when Barrick talks about authority, you know, really what I would say is this task force has been charged with the authority to make recommendations about the charges that we just presented to you. That is the authority of this task force. I think it's really important to note, this is not a mandate. If you were to look at something and say, we don't need to make any recommendations about data keeping, I highly don't think that will happen. But if we were as a group, we're like, we have all the data we've ever needed and there's no gaps in it, right? We are not mandated to make a recommendation where one is not required. And so I think that, you know, really as a group, that is our authority, that is our charge, is to make recommendations. And ultimately, we are mandated to provide 2 different reports, one at the end of year 1, one at the end of year 2. The first report is primarily would be what I call the status report, right? Where are we today? What have we reviewed so far? What are next steps? I would envision, again, report 2 will contain those recommendations. When I talk about recommendations, they are exactly that. These are not mandates to the state legislature. These are not mandates to agencies that they must do something. These are recommendations. And so Barrick touched on one final point that I think is super important, and that is, how will the task force make its decisions, right? Is this consensus-based, and or are we going to include the opinions of all task force members in these final reports? What I am going to say is this task force is deliberately comprised of a group of multidisciplinary professionals, and everybody's opinion here is important. So the task force will certainly proceed with recommendations as they see fit, but all those voices will be encapsulated in these final reports, as well as the minutes that we're taking, as well as these videos that we will be obviously maintaining beyond this task force as well. So by way of saying, you know, we would not produce a report that says, you know, 9 out of 12 people felt X, and the rest of you, we're not going to talk about that, right? And so I think that that's important. This is a state taxpayer effort. This is a legislative effort. And I think with that comes great responsibility for openness, transparency, and accountability, which is why we are taping these sessions. It's why we're taking minutes. It's why we have a website that will be dedicated and is up right now. I'll let Jordan talk about that or put a link in, where it is going to contain all of our material. So as we approach the report, again, I think it's critical that we involve all these voices and give them space. So Barrick, I'm going to stop for a moment and see if I have answered your questions, and then open up any questions potentially to other members.
I think on the role in agency, that was a fantastic overview. And we'll, when we get into the next session, I'm going to revisit those charges and our specific duties and talk a little bit about the process to get there. But we'll open it up to the group for any questions about what Stephanie's just shared, or what the responsibility is generally. with the caveat that after our break, I'm going to really drill us down into each of these specific things we're charged with analyzing. But welcome thoughts on structurally how we're approaching this work from what Stephanie just shared.
Oh, come on, you know I'm not that clear. Well, it goes without saying, I don't see any hands up, but I know many of you personally, and I just want you to know you always call me, email me, and you know that I'll get back to you, as will my team. So, you know, with that, Barak, is it probably a good time to build our structure? I know we need a vice chair.
Let's do that. Yes, we'll take care of the technical stuff, and then we'll sneak in a break and get back into the work itself.
I think we have Kevin with a question, Barak.
Yes, Kevin, jump in, please.
I just put a concern in chat and got a couple of other people to agree with me. Can what the task force is required to analyze be improved or added to if there's something obvious missing?
I'll let Stephanie correct me if I'm wrong, but I think if we are analyzing those things that we have been legislatively asked to, and that itself surfaces something connected to that, I believe that falls within our scope. Stephanie, does that feel right?
Yeah, I would agree, Kevin. This isn't like a checklist, right? And as you can see, even from the wording of this, I think that there is great room to interpret these charges as broadly as we need to, assuming we don't go into some absolutely different universe, right? But as chair, I am 100% open about that because, you know, that would be doing a good job.
Any other questions of clarification when it comes to the technical operation and how we're approaching the work before I'll get into our timeline and then those charges again? All right. Well, Stephanie said, I know everybody knows how to get hold of Stephanie. At the end of the meeting, I'll make sure you all know how to get hold of me and the entire Keystone team. But Stephanie, why don't we look at that technical side of operating and who we need to identify?
So it is necessary to identify a vice chair. It's part of our legislative requirement as well. And obviously there's just great operational, you know, importance to having a backup, because if I win the lottery and I disappear for 6 months, I want this group to move forward. So, you know, I think at this point, what I would say is that to give you a little bit of idea about the vice chair role, it really is, I think, fairly limited. By way of resources, let me just start with that. Again, we are lucky that this has been a state-supported or funded task force. With that resourcing, we've been able to secure Keystone and Barak and his team, who are going to be providing that administrative backbone for us, right? They will be here to lead our conversations, take minutes, do agendas, encapsulate our thoughts, and help us put that into a final report and or recommendation. So we're very lucky here. This is not a completely volunteer effort. The second resource that we have at the CPO is that we will be having a research assistant, if you will, who will be providing all of that information that I've talked to you about for each session, those educational sessions. So, you know, again, task force members, we absolutely want your input. And by the way, I want to thank Lynette already for sending me some resources in the chat. But again, you will not be required to research, you know, the next month's session or any of those things. So in terms of just sort of the day-to-day task force work, we are well resourced. The role of the vice chair would really be to assist the chair, especially in my absence. It would also be to just help me make sure that we are crossing all the I's and dotting T's, right? Making sure that we are getting minutes out and agendas out, and that we're responding to task members' questions to the extent that there may not be clarity or there may be concerns, and essentially just working with me as a partner to help lead this group. So if I were to say, you know, the workload involved, I would say it's maybe an hour a month is what I'm thinking, 2 at the max. We would welcome you to be part of the conversations with Keystone each month as we plan these meetings, as well as working with our CPO researcher to the extent that that is needed. So I'm going to say it's about a 90-minute commitment a month. And Jordan, I'm looking at you. She's nodding.
Yeah, I'd say it's 90 in addition to the meetings, any subsequent potential subcommittees we would form. But again, we would coordinate all those efforts that Stephanie mentioned, and we would coordinate all those meetings for all the members.
So, Varric, that's what I have to offer in terms of a job description. It is not paid. But you get the pleasure of like talking to me 90 minutes a month, if that's a pleasure. So I would be interested if there's any general folks that want to raise their hands for that. You know, the other option is if people are not ready to commit, we could also probably, Varric, take interest over the email between now and our next session, and we could then get back to folks who express that interest. So I'll stop there.
And I know we just really dumped that out at everybody, and I'm not seeing that rush to put hands up, which means I get to use between now and our next meeting to cajole, convince, and campaign for some of you to throw your hats in. So Stephanie, I think just given that we just put that all out for folks, to be fair to everybody, welcome you shooting us an email and letting us know. I will also include that in our follow-up that we're still looking for that, but give that some thought. It's an opportunity for you to work with the CPO team and with my team to help shape these conversations. And we certainly would appreciate an additional member of the task force serving in that role. So give it some thought, and I'll start hounding everybody. I'll probably give you until Monday before I start chasing you, and then I will do that. With that, though, I'm going to make a little executive decision to alter the agenda. I know people have been planted in your seats. We're coming on an hour and a half when we all start getting a little restless. I'm going to call for our break right now. I'm going to ask everybody, go ahead and turn your video off, hit yourself on mute, but stay connected to the call. And let's be right back here at 9:30, ready to go, and we'll dig into the work of the group. So thank you all. We'll see you in 10 minutes. It is 9:30. My promise to all of you has always been and will be to try to keep us on schedule the best I can. My favorite words are, I'm going to give us a little bit of time back. At minimum, I'm going to make sure we get done on time. So just a couple of reminders as folks come back on. If you are a member of the task force, I would love if you would put your camera on so your fellow task force members can connect names, roles, and faces all together as we have this conversation. If you are driving or in a place where it is otherwise not safe, please do not do that, however. If you are not a member of the task force and are a member of the public here to listen in or to share your thoughts, we certainly appreciate you giving your time to join this call today. We would, however, ask that you leave your video off for right now, just so the task force members can focus on seeing one another. And we will invite members of the public who would like to weigh in with their thoughts when we get to public comment, which we have scheduled on today's agenda for 10:45. So with that said, I'm going to go in just a minute to our work and some reflections on some of the survey data. One more nudge from me, and it'll be in an email that I'll follow up with you. I think we've got about 40 task force members, and I had about 10 responses to the survey so far. Would really love if you all over the next week or so could spend some time on that survey. It's just going to help my team and I to work with Stephanie and Jordan to make sure that these meetings and the substance and content of them are as useful to you as possible. That survey is designed for us to understand your perspective on some of the particular questions we're answering, and also where you're coming to this conversation in terms of your world of knowledge on some of the issues. So I'll ask you, if you don't get the survey, or if you didn't get that link, I'll be sending it out again. With that said, before I go back into the charges of the task force, we had a pretty robust first hour and a half there. And I want to give, for those who have any quick reflections, or if it raised any questions while you were taking that coffee break, any questions you'd like to just put out to the group, I'll create that opportunity now for 5-8 minutes if we need it, and then I'll move us right along. But feel free to raise your hand if there's anything you wanted to throw in, or if you were like me and you said, you know what, there was one thing I didn't get a chance to say. Offer it up now, or we can move right on. But raise your hand if you've got something, or just a reflection on that first session together. I guess we must have been really on point. That or people are still waking up and still getting caffeinated. I agree, Janelle. I just love all of the passion that everybody's bringing. And I will tell you, doing this kind of work is tough. It's tough for Stephanie and Jordan and their entire office. And My team who's been doing this, our organization was founded in 1975. And I will tell you, it does not get any easier, particularly when you're dealing with issues of children. I don't think there's anything more personal, more passion driven than the future of our kids. And that's rooted in how they're growing up in the conditions and circumstances and how we're supporting them. So I know we're going to have some tense conversations. I know we're going to have some disagreements. And I am so grateful for everybody's candor and the respect that's being shown for those different points of view. I'm going to do a little bit of screen sharing just so I can root us back into what it is that we're working to do. And Stephanie went over some of this, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time. But I want to remind about this task force that fundamentally, let me make sure I'm sharing the right screen with you all. This task force has been created to analyze the root causes of why children run away from out-of-home placement, to develop consistent, prompt, and effective response to recovering missing children, and address the safety and well-being of a child upon the child's return. We've got 2 years of meetings. And I know that sounds like a long time, but most of that we're going to be meeting, I think, every other month. And you all have been working on this for decades. I know in a lot of cases, there's a lot of material for us to get into. We've got those meetings, the regular meeting schedule that we'll go through. We may also be calling on you to do some interim work group meetings or some conversations, some pre-work. Our first report is due October of 2023, and a final report the following year, which will contain our findings and any systemic recommendations. And as Stephanie said, our findings may expand beyond some of the areas we've been specifically asked to analyze. Those findings will likely include both what this group identifies as the current state, as well as looking at some national exemplars or some possibilities for systems addressing other issues that we may want to integrate. The next slide is just, this is what Stephanie did cover. And I'll make sure you've got this in the overview. I'll get these slides circulated to everybody. It's a pretty robust set of items that we're required to analyze, running from the sufficiency of statewide data to the best practices and resources. And that's why I'm going to ask you to understand that whether it's me or another member of the team facilitating, when things start to go down a rabbit hole, we're going to try to bring us back to this. That said, I welcome your pushback to say, hey, Barrick, you know what? This actually does connect to this issue. And if you'll give me a little leeway, I'm going to show you how. But there's going to be a lot of times where we're going to say that really fundamentally falls outside because we've got this list of issues to dig into that is going to require a good amount of thinking. And part of what we need to understand, as I said at the start of this, is where everybody's coming into the conversation. I'm going to share a little bit about what we found in the survey so far. And while it's a small sampling, I want to just root everybody in what we're hearing initially. And it's not to judge what anybody says, I'm a 1 or a 5 or a 3, or here's what I know about it or don't know about it. It's to give you a little bit of insight into other members of the task force and where they're coming to this conversation. My biggest goal coming out of this is to hear from all of you, what do you need for us to do this work well? Is there specific research? Are there specific kinds of conversations you want to have as a group? Are there panels and presenters that you want to hear from, or just things we need to know more about? So I thought it'd be good for us to ground it in kind of where some of the members of this task force are coming into this conversation. So that first question you may have seen in the survey was, just how much do you think we know about the causes of youth runaway, since that's one of the key things we're required to dig into? I maybe made the error of making the easy answer. I often do Likert scales or these scales of 1 to 4 because it forces you to pick, I know a little or I know a lot. You'll see the majority said, I know some, I'm right in the middle of it. You don't see anybody though at that top level of I know almost everything. My goal over the next 2 years is going to be to have as many of us as possible say, I know most of what needs to be known. I think what I take away from this is we've got a grouping that says, I know some, but not a terrible amount, and quite a few on this task force who, although you work in individual areas of the issue, whether as a provider or law enforcement or advocate, we still just don't know enough about all of these causes. Another thing I wanted to just call out is what were some of the ideas that surfaced in some of the texts? And I just pulled a few of the ones that folks shared about what do they believe are the top causes. And it ranged from abuse in a facility, adolescent brain not being developed, to wanting to be home. wanting to get back to what someplace that they didn't feel as uncomfortable, or maybe they were threatened where they were. Some people thought maybe the cause of leaving that facility was that they didn't feel supported, or just that they wanted to get back to being with family or friends. On one of our other questions, we asked, what risks do you see are being associated with youth runaways or these behaviors? And I'll give everybody a minute to just take a look at what some of your colleagues on the task force offered as ideas. And this is not intended to be limiting, but just to give you a sense of what some folks are thinking about. You will see there were some themes in there when it came to the risks, whether that was human trafficking, drugs, homelessness, other forms of abuse and violence, or the potential for criminal behavior just to survive. This one, again, I'm going to give a few minutes, but thinking about both an individual youth safety and the difference between runaway behavior versus age-appropriate behaviors. Question was asked, what behaviors lead a person or facility to file a missing report about a child? And I think as you read through these, you'll see a lot of different perspectives, likely from the different point of entry into this conversation. And just to be clear, as I put these slides with folks' thoughts up, we're not individually identifying who offered these thoughts. And these aren't intended to say this is the fact or this is where this committee feels. But I always find it useful to give kind of a baseline. Here's where we are today. Today is really the start of us fundamentally digging into the issue of analyzing some of these challenges. And I think it's good for us to understand where people are starting today. And it will be interesting for folks to look at these as we talk about what conversations do we need to have. Are any of these prompting you to say, you know what, I think there's clearly some misinformation, and I think we need to have a conversation that hopefully surfaces a little bit more from what I understand. Or maybe somebody's saying, I hadn't thought about that, and I'd really like to know more about why there is that perspective about minors being committed to a facility that don't have the right to leave that facility. Or you'd like to understand what those rights are, or what are some of the predictive behaviors. So I hope you'll look at these not as any type of judgment or any type of predetermination of what we're finding, but rather where your colleagues are entering this conversation and sparking things that you may want to learn about or think that we as a group need to learn about. And again, I'll be sure to share all of these with you. I'm really looking forward to that number being close to 40 people that have completed the survey, because I think it'll give us a better baseline and a better, more holistic look at where the whole task force is entering this. But when it comes down to this question of how well informed do you feel about how Colorado prevents youth from running away from their out-of-home placement, we have a pretty small number that fall into that well or very well informed. Majority clumping there in the fairly, but I would say that what this tells me is the majority of our task force still feels that there's a lot of information to be gained and to be shared and talked about internally about what we're doing to prevent you from running away from some of these out-of-home placements. And then how would folks describe the current processes, official or unofficial, for responding? And I know we started to get just a couple of perspectives in this morning's session, but take a look at this and give some thought, because we're going to go into a conversation about what do we as a group need to do to dig into these. As you look at some responses, and without trying to say somebody is right or wrong, is it consistent with your understanding about the current processes? Are there things that you think there may be missing pieces? Are there things that you say, this is right on? And either way, what does it surface for you about the conversation we need to have? And what does it surface for you about who you'd like to hear from and the information that we can bring to all of you that is going to help you to provide informed thought and findings as we work towards that report for next October. And that gets into this next question, and I'm going to pivot us in just a minute into the conversation. But we asked what data would be useful to help you understand the current system, including any gaps or opportunities for improvement in reducing and responding. So take a look at what some folks identified, give some thought to what else should be on that long list of things we need to be able to take a look at. And as you saw in here, we've got folks that are wanting to know everything about what is the size of the problem, what are the actual policies, and how different players in this and stakeholders do in fact respond. What are the protocols? What does legislation dictate? Some folks teed up, what is the data from other states that may have different procedures? Can we learn from them when we're looking at our findings as we analyze this? And clearly some folks wanting to hear directly from the facilities and directly from those responding. With that, I'm going to get off of screen share, get back to seeing everybody's faces. And as I will usually do in these terms, one, I'm going to ask you, understand if I'm looking away from the screen, it's because I've got two others that I'm typing notes furiously on, along as I know my colleagues are. But in my standard form, I'm not going to call on people unless I'm not hearing from anybody. Then I take facilitator's discretion and I start calling on you. I'll give you about a 2-second heads up. But would love to start hearing from folks on two questions. One, what surprised you about the early survey findings? But more importantly, as you looked at that, and as we shared those charges that we have, and I'm going to put those back in the chat just so everybody has them handy. What is it that would help you do our work of analyzing these different issues to ensure that we can do our work and arrive at some recommendations in a report next October and in one to follow that? Apologize, it's not letting me dump it into the screen, but I will get there in just a second. Lynette, I see your hand is up.
I was just thinking, one thing that has worked in some other task groups and different things that we've done is an in-depth case study, not the one-outer that this is horrible, this is awful, or the child that just ran the one time. But can we do a case study and just focus in on all the different systems that interacted, what went well, what could have been done differently, and when could we have intervened earlier? It might teach us things that we're not even identifying.
And Lynette, are there any kind of spectrum of case studies you'd like to take a look at, or just a kind of random sampling of different incidents to look at, what went well? And would you want this group to analyze it, or would you want us to bring in some folks to help us take a look at it?
Well, I haven't given it that much thought, but I really group. But I like right off the top of my mind, I can think of a couple of youth that would be good examples of youth that started off without juvenile justice involvement and by the end had juvenile justice involvement, spent time in detention, got the multi-systems involved. Where could we have intervened better? Who's able to do what? Who can't do what? So that we can really figure out where the barriers are in our system.
Thank you, Lynette. Dave, some thoughts on what we need to do to be able to carry out our charge?
Well, I'm really curious what this research assistant will be able to provide us when it comes to data. I mean, we may think we know what the problem is, but we don't know what we don't know. We all have our own perceptions. And I really want to dive into, that's what I'm really looking for from the survey is what data do we need? What are we looking for to really work on this problem? How bad is it? Are there profiles of specific youth? I mean, those are the things that I'm looking for. Just don't know. I mean, I think we're all willing to participate and want to get going on this. We just don't know what the problem really is without the data.
So the size of the problem and who it is, kind of disaggregated data about what is the real scope of the problem and what do we know about who are those involved? Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, who it is, what youth are involved in that, and kind of going back and what happens to those youth? Where do they end up? How involved are they in a variety of different systems? Maybe that would help us identify what systems are working and which ones are not. Or services, not necessarily systems, but services also.
Yeah. Who else wants to jump in with given the scope of things we're asked to analyze, what's going to help you to really be informed in doing this work? Renee, I'll go to you, and then Lynette, I don't know if your hand is still up or if you've got another thought. All right, Renee, your thoughts.
Yeah, as I understand it, we're looking at youth in a variety of different settings, from the residential placements as well as foster homes. And I think it'd be really important to look at the differences in, or similarities, but I imagine there might be some differences in, in the problem in the different settings. It's not going to be the same, it might be some of the similar things that lead to running behavior. It may not, there might be some differences, but there's certainly going to be different solutions depending on the setting. For sure, a foster family is not going to be the same thing that a placement setter is going to do. So yeah, I'd be interested in kind of looking at the information by setting as well.
And are there formats that you think would be most helpful for this group? Would you be interested to look purely at data? Would you like to look at data and maybe have a panel that helps us understand it from some different settings perspectives? And if you don't know, I'm happy to work with my team and with CPO to structure that, but I want to be responsive to any thoughts you have.
Yeah, I think definitely making sure that when we're looking at the data, we're kind of slicing and dicing it in different ways to get the best understanding, because it's not going to be a uniform issue or uniform solution by setting. I think, I've deferred the second question to what the group needs. I think we all have such different experiences, and whether a panel would be helpful or not, but certainly the data piece, yes.
Right. And I want to make sure folks are hearing, because I want people to be able to build on one another. And there was a comment in the chat that when youth run, is there additional agencies available involvement? And what are the run periods? What's the length of stay after a run, and incident reports after are some of the ideas. So I'll capture those in the notes. What else, when you're thinking about what we're asked to analyze, and I can put that up again if it's useful, but I want to be able to see everybody's faces as much as possible. What types of data, what types of conversations, or who would be useful to hear from? Whether that's a panel of providers and law enforcement, a panel of those with lived experience, or different types of disaggregated data. Kevin, what are you thinking as we undertake this work over the next year or two?
Well, again, there's such a variety of different facilities is a problem that we have. But I'd be interested in taking a look at data over time. How many kids, or what percentage of kids are running from facilities? I'm talking about, back to 2000 and on up, because I think there's a perception that the problem must be increasing. And I've heard that from a couple of facility managers. My kid, as you know, has been in about 13 different placements. So I've heard that from a couple of facility managers that not that the law changed, but the way the law was interpreted and administered changed, and that made the runaway problem worse. I don't know if that's true or not. Sitting here today, I don't have that. But my question is, their perception is we've gone backwards in Colorado as far as exacerbating our own runaway problems from certain facilities. I guess I want to know if that's true or not.
So it sounds like looking at, both what is the scope of the problem, but what is the history behind that? Has it shifted? And maybe we can take a look at, have there been external factors, to your point, and whether it was a change in the law or just how it was administered? So really understanding the problem over time.
Correct.
Right. And I pause. I'm just looking at the chat to make sure I don't miss anything. I really want to make sure we use this time, appropriately to hear from all of you. We're going to take from today to shape starting in January and then our March meeting. Dave, what are you thinking would be useful to dig into? And do you have thoughts on how or what format that should be?
Dave Hayes.
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. So again, I'm new to all this, but I think the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I'll use an example. Is I'm on a couple of committees, and one of the things we heard from was for instance, the inmate count at the Department of Corrections. And while it goes up or down, one of the things that one of the questions I asked early on was, does that include, for instance, the number of inmates in the county jails that are waiting to go to the Department of Corrections. And of course, the number didn't include that. So I think it's important that the data shows us really the kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly, but kind of really what are the numbers, what are the number of people, and then and folks may have already addressed this at some point, but it would also be great to maybe hear from or have some information from some naysayers about the whole system, whether they went through the system and are now an adult, or an articulate parent or a guardian that can say, here's some things that I think that need to get addressed. So I think we need to hear everything. And we've all, I could tell by the group and experiences I've heard so far, and just in this brief phone call this morning, we're all pretty smart people. And I think we can differentiate between good news and bad news and real information and not so real information. So it'd be good to hear just kind of, again, like I said, the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Thanks, Dave. And I'm seeing it in the chat, some just weaving a lot of these ideas together, that we need really an objective look at the data, not trying to shade it to prevent us from looking at what may be going well or some of the problems and getting into percentages and the disaggregated data. It's real easy for us to look at a big number and apply it to all groups. And I think you're underscoring the importance of looking at it disaggregated. Becky weighs in here, and Becky, I don't know if you're in a place that you can come off mute and speak to this a little bit about getting in some. I've got a few scrolling in, but Becky, you had mentioned about hearing from a clinician or psychologist weighing in. Do you want to add any more to that?
Oh, I mean, yeah, I would just love to hear from someone like Dr. Jerry Yeager or someone. I mean, runs are obviously a trauma response. Kids are running to something or running from something. So I would like to hear what a professional with that experience would have to add. I would also, so many people are putting in great comments about data we would like to see. I'd like to know the number of moves each of these kids have prior to this run. So if a kid is running from Southern Peaks, have they been in 17 different facilities prior? I'd just like to see a bigger profile on our kids who are showing these behaviors.
Appreciate that, Becky. Ashley, you've got a comment in there about hearing from more youth, and I'm curious if there's topics where you'd like the opportunity to go deep, and certainly this is something that Stephanie and Jordan and I talked about just this week, of how do we get folks that are closer to that lived experience as opposed to a little older. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I just thinking to our agencies engaging in empowering youth work. And I think some of our biggest success has been going to facilities and having like focus groups and just, 10 youth at a time that are currently in facilities. We do kind of a presentation too, and we do youth surveys more about their legal counsel, but I could see something similar working for this purpose to really just, do a few of these focus groups, asking sort of similar questions in each one. And obviously it's very individualized, why this happens for each youth because of the trauma responses. But I think we would identify some common themes that might give us, might help us with some priorities or some things that might be really good to focus on first. But I do think infusing youth voice into this is really important, and that might be a tangible way to actually do that. You could form a little like subgroup to sort of volunteer to go do that and bring it back to the bigger group or something.
Stephanie, and then I'm going to ask Gina if I can get you to talk a little bit more about that facility perspective. But Stephanie, what's this making you think we need to dig into, or how?
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to some of the comments regarding root causes, and then Ashley, just to give you some greater amount of information. So again, we have researchers from the University of Denver who are in the process of working with facilities to conduct these focus groups. There's actually, as you well know, a research methodology and protocol that must be followed when speaking with youth. And so we are in the process of receiving that approval, I believe from the State Department as well as from the facilities themselves. I'm not familiar with the technical pieces of it, but to just make sure that we conduct those interviews in a trauma-informed way with the appropriate safeguards. So just wanted to let you know that that is in process. And as soon as those approvals are granted, The research questions also have to be approved, right? So we are working through getting those final approvals before those focus groups take place. So I just wanted to let you know that that is in the works, and it's just a matter of timing and clearance on that stuff.
And I see Kristen confirming. So maybe I'm going to bring Kristen on the screen if I could get you to talk a little bit about that process and where things are and what you see unfolding.
Thanks, Kristen. I knew you were here and I was frantically scrolling and I was going to ask you to jump in. So thank you for raising your hand.
No problem. Yeah, happy to provide any updates. So we have our paperwork kind of completed on our end. We're just waiting for some letters of support. So I'll be reaching out to those folks to see that we can get that, so that hopefully that will help this process move more quickly through our approval process. And as soon as we have that, then I am ready to go. So yeah, we are hoping to get into the facilities and get these interviews conducted. We are going to be offering an incentive for folks that want to participate in this, and that will be including the youth that are served in the facilities, as well as family members. And so we're really trying to get the whole picture here. In regards to all of the systems that you have mentioned today, we want to make sure that that is represented as well.
And Kristen, before you go, can you just introduce yourself formally, your title, and just a bit about your background so folks can put it all in context?
Sure, you bet. So I am Kristen Myers, and I am an assistant professor at the University of Northern Colorado, but working with Denver University, we're all friends in academia here, to conduct the focus groups for this study. A little bit of background about me. I have been in education for the last 20 years in some form, and have worked in schools with young people who've experienced foster care and out-of-home placement. So I have that kind of background, and then also served as the state coordinator for foster care education at the Department of Education for about 4 years. So I've worked with some of you in that role on this call. And so definitely have some background into what folks are talking about and the trauma responses that folks experience. I also have a background in research on young people who've experienced foster care. So coming into this with some baseline knowledge, and also with a completely open mind as to what the young people have experienced themselves. And that's really the whole purpose of this research, is to fully understand their lived experience and to not have any of my bias or lens play into that.
Thank you, Kristen. And Gina, I'm going to pull you in just a second to probe a little bit on what type of information from facilities would be useful. But Kristen, while I've got you off mute, or at least on screen, I'd love to open it back up to our task force members to understand from you all what types of things are really of interest, or as Kristen does this, what are the things you're looking to hopefully get some insight into from these youth?
So I think we can learn a lot about why youth run. There are times when you think about running and don't do it. What is it that is preventing them from running? We can learn from that as well.
Absolutely. I am writing all this down.
Hey, Kristen.
Other members of, yeah, go ahead, please.
Oh, sorry, I didn't follow protocol. I'll work on the little hand. Yeah, Kristen, I think one of the things that I am also eager about, earlier in this conversation, I brought up the notion of terminology and labeling. And I fear that when we label a youth as, quote, a runaway, and as many people here on this call have said, youth experience multiple runs, right? What is the impact of that? Like, we're like, I'm a runaway, right? Like I am now been labeled by the system as this thing, and I've done this thing now 13 times. What does that impact on youth from a standpoint of, well, that's who I am, this is what I do, nobody seems to care? Like, I'm just curious about what their impressions are, I guess, of our system and our reaction and our responses, which I worry about those things.
Yeah. And Stephanie, you undoubtedly saw in the chat, some folks were asking, what even is a run? What is our definition when we come to things like that? And Ashley said, it'd be interesting to hear about the first time. Does a youth have different rationale, or is there a different thought process that third or fourth time they've run from the fourth or fifth facility versus that first time that they got to that point where they said, this is what I need to do?
I'm struggling with I don't understand that question. What is a run? I don't. I mean, if a place, a facility, or else a facility ground, to me, that seems like obviously a run. And they know they can't do that. I'm confused by the question.
Appreciate that, Kevin.
Do you want me to answer what I meant by that?
Well, I'm going to give you some time. I hope right now we can really focus on brainstorming the questions that we want to explore, rather than turning this into that forum. But Janelle, yeah, I want to make sure that that's not left ununderstood if there's something specific that you're thinking about.
Okay, just real quick, I was just saying, and I know that Becky had sent a link, and in there it talks about a youth, anybody that leaves the place without permission for more than one night. The point of my question was, I believe if they leave at all, but how long do we wait until we call? What constitutes as a runaway? Things like that. And multiple different placements seem to have multiple different definitions of what that is. So just kind of wrapping around that education of what really constitutes as a run, especially when it comes to reporting it to law enforcement or DHS or things like that. That's more what I meant by that,
So
not what
maybe
the actual definition.
Yeah, so maybe it's less the definition and more how are actions taken and what are different procedures and protocols at different time intervals or events.
But it was one of the survey questions is the reason I asked the question. And I couldn't understand the reason for the question. So that explains it. It's nothing gee whiz, but it confused me whenever, to answer the survey question.
Okay, I appreciate that. And it helps me to design surveys a little bit better next time. So thank you, Kevin. I'm going to go to Renee and then Elizabeth and then Beth. Either thoughts of what you'd like to hear from kids or overall things that you think we need to know better.
Yeah, I just wanted to raise when we're looking at the data and trying to get a better understanding of these things. We're talking a lot about reasons in terms of the kid's intentions or what the kid was wanting or why, things like that. I think it's really important to also raise it. Often the reason is that kids are impulsive, and oftentimes there isn't I wanted to do this or I needed to get home or something like that. But in the moment, there may have been a trigger more than and they're not even really acting with a lot of, frontal lobe to, be deciding what they want to do or where they want to go or anything like that. But it's more a reaction in the moment. And that's, I think, a whole category that we're not really, it's not really kind of included in some of the language we're using here. Just want to make sure we're thinking of the whole range of circumstances that can lead to running.
And I do want to clarify, because I promised Gina I would dig in a little bit more on the facilities. Elizabeth, Beth, and Brandon, are your questions all relating to what Kristen's looking at as far as what we would want to learn from you? Great, then let's tag you in. Elizabeth and then Beth and then Brandon, please.
Hi, Kristen. I'm wondering if you'll be able to interview some kiddos who have been sent to these facilities voluntarily placed because of other types of behaviors. Because Timmy was sent to the residential place because of ongoing suicidal ideation and hospitalizations, as opposed to kids who were forcibly taken from their homes and placed by DHS. Because I think there might be some different perspectives as to why the kids run, from their homes and from voluntary placement, as opposed to the kids who were forcibly removed from their families.
Thank you so much for that. That is really important. And that's something that we can definitely ask about on our demographics sheet. And I think that's very important to capture. And so that we're also looking at that when we're looking at the quotes and seeing if maybe there's a difference there.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Beth and Brandon, please.
Kristen, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the HRV tool, the standard screening that's used in Colorado for trafficking. So the high risk victimization tool, I can add it in the chat. Obviously, it's pretty lengthy. I think for some of it could be trimmed down, but really just kind of, asking the youth while they were on the run, were they, forced to do anything that they didn't want to do, anything happened that alarmed them. And really, I mean, I guess we could all just look at the HRV tool and figure out what specifically we could choose from that. But just, and I will say the HRV tool we are looking at, I know the Colorado Human Trafficking Council is looking at expanding that because it's the labor trafficking piece of it is very narrow in focus. And that's also happening with these youth.
Thank you so much for that, Beth. Yeah, one of the things that I'll be using is something called a semi-structured interview protocol. So I've captured a lot of these notes. I'm taking notes on everything that everybody would like to see in that. And I think that tool will be very useful. And if the task force could work together to see what would be most useful to include in asking all of our participants the same questions, that would be really helpful.
Brandon and then Renee, and before I bring you in, Kristen, you saying that I may reach out to you to see if there isn't a more comprehensive way in addition to this, that we can bring you some of those thoughts and ideas for questions. But Brandon and Renee on this topic of what we'd want to know from youth, and then I'm going to get back to Gina and talk facilities. Brandon.
Yeah, so kind of along the lines of what Renee was saying, Kristen, like, are you just interviewing the kids, or is it precipitating factors and context to the situation? Because, in my experience, most, assigning rational behavior to irrational thought patterns is, hard. And I think to analyze, and I feel like a lot of these situations are impulsive and irrational. So the motive, at the time when they're thinking about it, like, when they're calmed down is going to be very different than in the time that is happening. So like, are you going to be looking at precipitating factors and things like that during the interviews?
Yeah, we'll be looking at, and we can see what would be most useful in terms of grouping young people together. If you feel that there would be an advantage to grouping folks, I don't know, just to use Elizabeth's example of folks that have been voluntarily placed or involuntary placed. If there's a group that would make more sense to get that essence might make sense. And in terms of what we ask the youth, it really is what we're prompting is hoping to really get to what comes up for them and to really get to what their lived experience is with these things. And so, yeah, I think that in terms of precipitating factors, I will leave it up to the task force to see if you think that it would be beneficial to group people together or not. I don't know if that answers your question, Brandon.
Thank you both. Renee, other thoughts on what would be helpful for this task force, thinking about what we're looking to examine, to hear from you?
Yeah, I'm actually going to stick with that line of thinking for a bit. And I'm curious, are we also doing a similar like focus groups with the staff? Because I do think, again, I'm going to keep with this point that we're not going to get the full picture at all by asking kids their reasons, and especially like Brandon mentioned, their after the fact reasons. All humans apply rational reasons to things we've done in the past that don't match with really what went on in the moment. And I think the information from the kids will be really important. So I think that's great that we're doing that, but it's just not going to give the full picture at all, and not necessarily, the accurate picture in a lot of cases. That's just not how human brains work, and especially adolescent young people, human brains.
Yeah,
Kristen, I don't know if that's in your scope or not. Renee, before I ask Kristen to address it, I'm certainly going to capture that as a note that making sure we have that staff perspective sounds like would be useful for the task force. But
and maybe parents or whoever is around them and is able to see in the moment what's going on is really important.
Yeah, in answer to that, Renee, yes, the legislation included requiring us to review staff perspectives as well as parent perspectives and youth. So it's not from just one lens that we're looking at this information.
Brandon and Lynette, and then I am going to bring Gina in, I promise. So Brandon and Lynette, if it's on the topic of hearing from youth and this work that Kristen's doing.
Yeah, I just one follow-up comment to that too. And taking into account that, traumatic, the runaway itself is traumatic, and, their truths, perceptively are going to be adjusted through that traumatic experience as well, can be distorted through the process along with it. So taking that into account, is important.
Thanks, Brandon. And for those, go ahead, Kristen.
Sorry, but I was just going to say that, yeah, that is something that we will be reviewing through looking at the interview protocol, is really taking a trauma-informed lens. I am a licensed professional counselor as well, so in taking that into consideration when conducting the interviews and ensuring psychological safety of our participants.
And I want to assure everybody, I don't want to cut this conversation off, and I'm happy to circle back to it. I also want to respect some of the ideas that had previously surfaced. Jordan did drop into the chat exactly what the legislation calls for when it comes to these focus groups. So I think you'll see when it's looking at those under 22, as well as for those providers and what Kristen's working on. We'll get back to Kristen if there's more questions. But Gina, I want to respect, you had flagged something about hearing from the facility. And I'm curious if you want to offer a little more color to that. Is it hearing from the facilities themselves? Is it the administrators, the staff? What specifically do you think would be helpful for this group to dig into from that lens?
So it's actually going back to Lynette's comment a couple hours ago, right? About the facilities all seem to have elopement as an exclusion for their services and their locations. And so I think it would be good for this group to understand how did that come about? What do they consider to be elopement? Is it recent elopement? I'm saying, right, that some of these are elopement 5 years ago, but they're still saying they have elopement in the background. Therefore, we will not accept them. I think it's important to hear from the facilities as well about how they not only are using elopement in their inclusion or exclusion criteria, but how they feel about having elopement as a part of it. And Lynette, did you want to add anything to that, since I kind of took it off your comment?
No, I appreciate it. I think the other thing that might be helpful for Kristen for your research, I know it's a different perspective and it's not in the scope that you've talked about, but getting the caseworkers feedback on why that youth might be running, because their perspective maybe is that placement is not a good fit for that youth, or they've had 3 changes of therapists, and so they're not getting the continuity of care, and you may miss those other aspects if you're not looking at it.
I appreciate that perspective, Lynette. And I want to name, I certainly did not tell Kristen that I was going to call her on the video, and she didn't know I was going to even open it up to the brainstorm. There's going to be some things that may be outside the scope of what is the legislative or the agreement that was reached with DU. I'll coordinate and talk with Stephanie and Jordan and Kristen, and where it does fall outside of that scope, we'll look at ways to make sure that those different perspectives that you're raising both inform this task force, and where we can with timeliness, help Kristen and her team to shape what they're doing. So I want to both honor all the ideas and not make it seem like Kristen gets to take on the world because I opened up a brainstorm. So we'll get at it. It just may be through various means. Other thoughts, and I want to really kick the doors wide open. And I had dropped as a text file because it wouldn't let me paste the full list of things. When you think about what we're looking to analyze, who do you want to hear from? And whether that's because we do a survey of some different folks, whether that's we put together a panel, what data is going to be helpful to you? What perspectives? What knowledge do you need to bring that, hey, I know a little bit, to I really know what it's going to take to shape things? And full transparency, I'm about at the point where I'm going to start calling people in so that I make sure we get those different perspectives. And Chase and Brian, I'm going to just tee you up that after the silence, I may ask you guys, because I'd be curious from your perspective, what either you would like to know or what you think we do need to know. Dennis, I'm going to jump up to you first, though, and that gives Brian and Chase a minute to think about that.
So my thought is when we're having these focus groups, because there's been a lot of discussion about physically intervening. That's not a free intervention. There's a cost for those interventions. That traumatizes youth. I want to hear from the youth. How would you feel if we started restraining children and youth that tried to remove themselves from a facility, just walk out of the facility? Because a lot of times they're walking out because they need space from the facility, right? I want to hear from them what they feel about that, because I think they're going to have some strong opinions.
There are probably strong opinions about that right in this task force.
Yeah, I have a strong opinion about it.
I would say there's probably a conversation we can structure for this task force members and getting the different perspectives from the physical to the psychological, the short term to the long term implications of things like that. So I appreciate you raising that. Brian and Chase, I am going to call you guys out. It happens because I see you right in the middle of my screen, and I'm curious from the seat you are in, where you have folks that respond. What do we need to know? What would you like to know?
So the spot I'm in, I really kind of view law enforcement in this as a support system to the children who have run and to the providers who are trying to provide the supports for them. There's a variety of reasons these kids end up in the placement facilities that they end up, whether it be because the parents seek out the resources or because the state has to come in and mandate the resources. Every kid's going to be different. Every circumstance is going to be different. And so it's really hard for law enforcement to come in. We're such a blunt instrument. And so what I'm looking to learn is more about what does the community who does serve these kids so closely, their parents and the state providers, the treatment facilities, what do they see as the best role? Because we have this kind of process we've done with runaway kids, but it's very stereotypical. And the kids we're talking about in this task force are not stereotypical. They're all very, very unique with circumstances that bring them here for different reasons. And so I don't want to say that I don't bring a lot to the table. I like to think that I have some value, but I really feel like in this, I want to see what others think our role is and how they think that we can support, as in law enforcement, in that first response sort of level, support best. What is the best way to handle it? And I agree that physical intervention is something that must be done with great care and great thought. And so where do we draw that line that it needs to happen, as opposed to maybe there's a better way? Maybe we can slow this down. Maybe we don't have law enforcement go out. Maybe it's better to handle it as an administrative process, and then all eyes on, looking for the child. I don't have an answer. I guess the question I pose probably more questions towards the group than I'm ready to provide, I guess.
And I want to thank you for that. I think that's part of what this whole process of discovery it needs to entail is identifying from somebody in your role or another role, hey, here's what I need to understand better to be able to make those kind of recommendations. Chase, what are your thoughts? Either on things you'd like to gain from this, from somebody working with officers responding, or things that you think would be productive for the overall group to have a perspective on?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Brian had some great thoughts on that. I think from a perspective, at least with our agency here, is how can we support? And because there might be limited education, so I would like to see maybe some more education for our folks. Like I said, we've talked with Southern Peaks specifically about doing briefing trainings for us, but how can we support? Because I agree with that. It's not our role just to go in there and take over, but at what point does the support turn into enforcement? We hate to see that, but like I said earlier, with liability and some of the red tape with these kiddos running away, at what point does the support role turn into an enforcement action? And I'd really like to know from some of these kiddos, at least at Southern Peaks, what we've seen is they're almost more interested in going to an actual correctional facility. So a lot of the kids that we deal with that have run away from the facility are more interested in going back to either Denver Youth Corrections or Pueblo Youth Corrections. And I'd be interested to know why that is versus the treatment facility route. So I guess just to summarize that is, how can we support, like Brian had stated, and then also at what point, from the law enforcement side, I know at what point it turns from supporting role to actual an enforcement role, but I would love feedback on what everybody else feels that should be. Understanding that we do have a liability towards this stuff, and then also just the perspective from the kids on what the difference between facilities is, why they want to be in one rather than the other.
Appreciate that, Chase. And I think we probably have some pretty powerful conversations about what are those different implications of when that line does extend from support to enforcement, and how can you support both the youth and the staff involved. Ashley, you dropped a comment in the chat, and I'd love to invite you to share a little bit more about what type of conversation or data, when we're talking about whether it's multi-agency or multi-professional response to different situations. And you highlighted, you know, the Denver system right now of pairing law enforcement with mental health. But what type of conversation and information would be helpful, you think, as we undertake this analysis?
Well, I can speak for myself that I am immersed in the child welfare aspect of this work. And while our attorneys also do some delinquency work, I am just not familiar with kind of current best practices, promising practices, pilot projects going on through straight law enforcement channels. So I hear about it maybe in the news or something. And I wonder if there aren't some pilot projects and efforts happening on law enforcement side that could be adapted to this sort of work in a positive way. And it's one of those where you just don't know what you don't know. So I just am not very educated and don't know a lot about what law enforcement is doing in different areas outside of child welfare. But, you know, the STAR model is something I've seen in the news. And so that's what's prompted this question for me. So it's more just learning, you know, that other aspect that I'm not as familiar with.
I appreciate it. And I do want everybody to feel completely comfortable not having to name, I want this specific piece of disaggregated data and this person from this agency, to just say, hey, I know there's some interesting things that may be happening in other areas, in whether it's another state or just other agencies, and I'd like to understand it to see if I can learn from it. I'm going to go to Beth next, and not to put folks on the spot, but Chelsea or Anna, we haven't heard much from you, and I want to make sure you feel comfortable jumping in if you have thoughts, but I won't call you out if you don't want to. I just want to create the window. Beth, your thoughts. What can we bring to this group that's going to help you make more informed recommendations and help us have better conversations?
Yeah, I guess I want to tie in with just some of the things that Chase had said, and also the mental health component with law enforcement. So it is not mandated in Colorado for law enforcement to be CIT certified, so crisis intervention training. I know that's a push for a lot of command staff, but it comes down to staffing. It's not built into academies. So, you know, that's a breakdown, and looking at really how many sworn peace officers are actually CIT certified. In regards to the post certification, in regards to dealing with youth, and engaging with youth, there really isn't anything other than, you know, they spent, you know, it's been a while since I was in the academy, but a small section just on children's code, not actually engaging with youth. Because, and I apologize who said it, but, you know, going hands-on with the youth, obviously that would be extremely traumatizing. And then similar with, you know, sending out an officer that's in a uniform, that's a barrier for that youth. And I can speak for, you know, my unit in Denver Public Safety Youth Programs. We are certainly strategizing to look at other options of removing that uniform officer to responding, both helping with their calls for service, but also that trauma-informed approach when interacting with a youth in crisis.
Thanks, Pat. Brandon.
Yeah, no, I just want to comment. I know the hands-on thing. I guess I agree with everybody. I mean, I would like to know there is alternatives to stopping kids from running. But ultimately, I think, I just want to make it clear, like, at the end of the day, these kids are ultimately, somebody's going hands-on with them and physically intervening with them, whether it's law enforcement or, a staff member or somebody. So the reality is, when they're caught, somebody is physically intervening on them. So the fact of, traumatization around it, it's really not a question of, is that happening or not happening, or because at the end of the day, it's inevitable. The method that is going on right now, these kids are getting physically stopped at some point down the line. And we don't have a better alternative at the moment in the behavioral health world. And so, if there is a better alternative, I think everybody would be all on board with that. But I think one of the questions here is, should that alternative be, or when that physical stop should happen, is it fall in law enforcement hands, or does it fall at the facility or the out-of-home placement hands? So I don't want to lose sight that, like, that's what's happening already. It's just happening with law enforcement right now. It's not happening with the care providers.
I'm going to go to Chase and then Elizabeth.
I'm going to piggyback on what Brandon said, and I agree with him. I want, yes, from a law enforcement perspective, and I'm sure from a facility perspective, I think it's just as traumatizing for our folks as it may be for kids. And while I recognize that it might be different, any true professional doesn't enjoy having to do that. So I would love to see if there's mitigating factors for that also.
Thank you. Elizabeth, Brian, and Norma, in that order, please.
Just to speak to what Brandon said, it is true people are using hands-on intervention at some point. And personally, as a parent, I would rather see that be at the facility or in their placement, right? Because they're trained in these therapeutic management holds anyway. They're just only allowed to use them if the kid's a danger to themselves or others, right? So I would like to see them be able to enforce those boundaries so the kid understands, hey, I've got to stay at this placement. I'm not going to go anywhere, as opposed to seeing law enforcement exhaust their resources. Because I would rather have somebody, and this is maybe not the right terminology, but I'd rather somebody tackle my kid to the ground and throw him in the locked quiet room for an hour and deal with the trauma on the backside, as opposed to seeing him on the road at getting hit by a car, right?
Thanks, Elizabeth. Brian, Norma, Kevin, in that order. And I would love it, to the extent you can, in addition to, if you're responding to something, thinking about really how that should manifest in the conversations or the information we as a group dig into. So Brian, Norma, and Kevin, please.
So I'd like to see this. We've talked about this going hands-on, and that's really like the kludge. And we have a lot of guidelines in law enforcement about when we do that, when we don't. I'd like in this context that this group begin to answer the question of, how do we determine when an immediate like exigency is existing, or when this is something that's handled once cooler heads have prevailed. For example, a 17-year-old who leaves one of these facilities often may not need that exigent response, whereas a 4-year-old would need an exigent child abduction level response. So how is it we draw these lines? And again, that's something that law enforcement maybe isn't in the best position to draw lines like that. The treatment providers, the people who know these kids better, would be able to say, because there's a huge difference between saying, we'd like for law enforcement to keep their guys out for this kiddo, and oh my gosh, we have an emergency. And so how do we draw that in a thoughtful way, so that the responding officers who don't have all that information necessary to make those determinations, can then get that context in place so that then they do have the ability to make that decision of, do I need to forcibly take custody of this kid for their own safety? Or is this one where we should talk a lot more and help the kid understand what's going on, and how do we make those decisions? So that's kind of what I'm hoping for in this conversation.
Can I offer an additional law enforcement perspective?
Sure. Dave, jump in, then I'm going to go Norma, Kevin, and Chase. If your hand is back up, I'll get to you.
Okay. So we've got in Louisville, we have Centennial Peaks, which is one of the big mental health facilities in Denver. I think there's one in the Springs and one in Louisville. And I guess I would equate some of this conversation to that. We on occasion get elopements from Centennial Peaks. Sometimes they're juveniles, sometimes they're adults. But one of the questions, or one of the first things I dealt with as the chief here about 8.5 years ago, was we had an elopement. Back then we were still calling it an escape. And the officers here were gonna in essence call out the dogs. And I simply posed the question to my new staff is, well, what are the dogs going to do, and what are you going to do when you contact the individual? Well, we're gonna they didn't use the word drag, but the message was we're gonna drag them back. And I said, well, hold on, they've eloped. The law isn't very clear about the officer's ability to use force even on a 72-hour hold on the front end, much less when somebody has eloped from a facility absent a specific order from the judge to do that. So I think that's, I don't know whether it's a legislative change, and one of the other law enforcement officers on the call mentioned this as well. We don't want to get our law enforcement officers too tied up in some of these areas where the law isn't clear. And as you all know, our law enforcement officers lost their qualified immunity in last year's legislative session. So I guess we have to think at it from a couple different ways. One is probably not law enforcement if there's an alternative to that. And then for agencies that have big facilities, like some of the agencies on the call, I think they've got to be pretty clear in what their policies and procedures are, and maybe some direction from the facility or the appropriate judge, if it depending on why the juvenile was placed in that facility, what authority he or she is going to give to law enforcement to return that person to the facility. So I'll stop there, but thank you.
I appreciate it. You provided, because certainly one of the things we're supposed to analyze is that process of responding to and returning somebody who has left the facility. And so there's not just the process of doing it, but what are the physical issues? What are the procedures and protocols? So I appreciate all of you surfing some of that. Norma, and then Kevin.
So unfortunately, I had to step out for a bit. And so I'm not sure if you all spoke about this, but once we reach the point where a child is going to run from a facility, lots of things have sort of happened to get to that point. And so by the time we get there, a child's looking to control something at that point because they're feeling really out of control. And so the run behavior is a way for them to control what's happening, to make a decision for themselves about how they're going to move forward in whatever situation they're in. And then staff feel really out of control because they're scared about the child leaving and something happening to them. So they're controlling the situation too. And so I think some of the things we need to understand is, what do children need prior to getting to that point, right? Like as we talk about prevention for kids, right? Even stopping them from having to go into an out-of-home placement. Once they're in an out-of-home placement, we should be looking at prevention for a lot of these kinds of things. And so what do they need from the people around them, the adults around them, to help them slow down? And sometimes I think that the things that they need go against the grain of what treatment settings think they should be doing in those situations. So sometimes really giving them some space, even though we think it's not the safest thing, just things like that. And I know this probably sounds remedial for some of you, Brandon, I'm sure for you, but I just think maybe we need to spend some time asking children what would have been helpful prior to the run. If they can think back to that point, what might have been helpful.
I appreciate that, Norman. And I think that surfaces conversations for us to have. And I see Kristen nodding her head and thinking about, you know, that question for you of what would have prevented it from getting there, and having the conversation, to your point, as a task force, and maybe bringing some folks to the table to talk about, is conventional thinking on what to do always aligned with what would actually be productive in mitigating some of this? Kevin, your thoughts on what would be helpful for us to dig into or to understand better? Kevin, you're still on mute. Thanks.
I want to piggyback on what Elizabeth said, which I agree with, which is, as the other parent on the call, if hands-on or like, if we're in a desperate situation where it needs to be hands-on, I'd much rather that be at the facility than out in the community by law enforcement. So I agree with that. But the other aspect is a conversation I had with a facility executive director that runs facilities over the country. And he made the point, if a facility has the ability to put hands-on, that has the effect of deterring other kids whenever they're confronted with running away. In other words, if someone's running away, I mean, basically the word gets out like wildfire that this facility can't touch you, and then that becomes an option if facilities don't have that right to eventually put hands on someone, obviously with all the appropriate protocols and that kind of thing. I thought that was a great point by that particular executive director.
An interesting point. Maybe we can certainly look at how different procedures and protocols are affecting both the incidents and the data. And I think, Kevin, weaving that back into some other things I heard, you know, are there the immediate effects of that in what the decision-making process is, and does it have any longer-term implications? So it sounds like a number of conversations and data points we could look at. I don't see any other hands, and I want to give a few minutes. We're actually about 5 minutes ahead of schedule, which I know nobody would be upset about, but I want to give the room, specifically thinking about our work ahead and how we use our time together or between meetings. Are there things that you would like to learn? Is there information that my team can bring to you? Are there panels or experts that would help you to dig into these analyses we need to do, or just conversations that as a task force, you would say, let's make sure we go deep on something. And I also welcome, I'm going to right now, as I will throughout all of our meetings, drop my email into the chat. Something comes to mind after this meeting in the next week, the next month, and you say, hey, I'd really like to see us dig into this. Drop me an email, and my team will work with Stephanie and Jordan and the office there to dig into what we can. Seeing no questions, before I start the process to talk about next steps and closing out the meeting, I know we do have a number of members of the public here, and at each of these meetings, although we aren't able to accommodate public participating in each agenda item or each task force issue, we do welcome members of the public to make comments at each meeting. And with that, I'd ask any members of the public, if you would like to make a comment for this task force to hear and to become part of the record of our meeting, to raise your hand in the chat room, or if you are on a phone and can't, you can always use *6 to mute and unmute yourself, and *9 to virtually raise your hand even if you're on a phone. So if there's any members of the public that have thoughts they'd like to share with this committee, I'll call on you now. I will note that for the public comment section, we welcome your comments. We, however, do not have the room for them to turn into discussions with responses or reactions from the task force. But your comments are part of the recorded memorization or memorialization of this meeting. And Steve Fisher, I see your hand up and would invite you to weigh in.
Yes, can you all hear me?
We can indeed, Steve. Thanks for being with us.
Great, really appreciate the opportunity. I'll just introduce myself briefly. The Zoom ID on there is from my day job. I'm a civil engineer, but I'm also a board member of the Federation of Families for Children's Mental Health Colorado chapter. And the reason I'm a board member is actually because I've lived across the street from Tennyson Center since 1995. So I've seen hundreds of runs and rescues. What my comment is, it speaks somewhat to Dave Lee's idea to look at misinformation and regulations. And also Chase Leonard alluded to the large gap in the safety net. Staff at facilities can't restrain kids from leaving the campus, and then law enforcement returns them ostensibly to safety. To offer my point, I would propose you imagine a facility located in a pleasant, idyllic setting, but it happens to be right at the edge of the Royal Gorge. When they built the facility, it was obvious that a fence was needed around the property to keep the kids safe from the risk and, like a swimming pool, from attractive nuisance and liability of the gorge. No one questioned this. In fact, in rules 7.705.53A3, it says that the grounds of the facility shall be maintained in a manner that is free from any hazard to health or safety, and that fences shall be in good repair. My point is that any one of the residential facilities and even facility schools we're talking about are like this Royal Gorge facility, except with no fence. Yet somehow a fence around the campus is conflated as lockdown. I've read the statutes and rules 7.701 through 7.714. Lockdown refers to doors to rooms and to buildings. A fence around the property is not restraint and is not lockdown. Think about how a fence would allow facility staff to follow all the rules and procedures, allow kids to blow off steam. Most campuses are several acres in size, while also keeping them safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Appreciate you joining the meeting and offering that thought for this group to consider. Just with Dennis, I'll get to you just one second. I just want to make sure if there's other members of the public that I haven't had a chance to call on. Seeing none, Dennis, your thoughts.
So we talked quite a bit about Southern Peaks today. And so I wanted to mention something about Southern Peaks. At this point in Colorado, providers are having a really difficult time serving really behaviorally acute children and youth. They tend to be very assaultive and aggressive. Southern Peaks at this point is serving our most difficult children and youth in Colorado. So I challenge the narrative of folks saying, hey, we're helping out a business. Yeah, Southern Peaks is a business, it's a nonprofit, but what they're doing is they're serving Colorado's most difficult children and youth to serve. And if Southern Peaks is not serving those children and youth, then we're going to send them out of state somewhere. And that's a bad outcome that nobody wants to see. So I think that's just important to bring into the conversation.
I appreciate your comment. Thank you, Dennis. Do we have any other members of the public that would like to make a comment? Seeing none, I'm going to go over just some quick next steps and then invite Stephanie and Jordan to close us out. One, I want to own and apologize to all of you that you didn't receive the formal minutes from our last meeting in advance. And without making excuses, I will just own that I snuck away last month to go get married, and my colleague Trace, who you met at our first meeting, is out on parental leave. Welcome to beautiful baby a few weeks ago. Trace will be back with us soon. We've got those minutes cleaned up now, so we'll make sure that you get all of those along with minutes from today in the coming weeks, so that you've got all of those. We can formally adopt and approve it in an upcoming meeting. On the subject of next meetings, in addition to getting those minutes and an agenda that will be responsive to everything we've heard from you today, our next meetings for your calendars, you should see those on January 4th and on March 1st. We're meeting about every other month. So those should be on your calendars. If not, reach out to me. We'll make sure we get those to you. And again, we're going to digest everything we've heard from you today. In addition to those modules that Stephanie and Jordan have talked about, we're going to tailor those to really be responsive to what we're hearing from all of you. I will put one more plug in, finish that survey for me. It'll help us to be even more responsive. But I will say today has been incredibly helpful to me, and I hope it has to you, in hearing from one another about where everybody's coming into this conversation. I want to honor all of you for the candor I know these are tough issues. I know you're raising issues and perspectives that may be uncomfortable. Some may be unpopular. They're also very personal to you. And I appreciate all the passion and a willingness to be open with everybody and to assume the best intentions from everybody, including those whose views you may not share or who you think we may be able to talk through some different ways. I'm capturing everything that is in the chat into our running notes to support us. But with that, Stephanie, I'll hand it off to you to close us out for the day and thank everybody for their time.
Great. Thank you, Barrick. And again, thank you all for being here. Super illuminating conversation. And I really appreciate, Barrick, you and your team being able to give us the space today to really find out what's on the task force members' minds. You know, this is your task force as experts in this field and experts in your own lives. And so, you know, we don't want to create agendas that are unresponsive to the needs that have been presented here today or the desire for specific information. So just thank you for the brainstorming time. It's important. Again, this is not a prescriptive process, and it will help certainly direct and tailor our work. And again, always a pleasure to see all of you. I have put my contact information directly into the chat. If there are things that you want to bring to my attention, things that I should know, conversations you want to have, just feel free to contact me, and I'm pretty good about getting back to folks. So on that note, we will be back in touch with a future agenda minutes and where we go next. So thank you all.